Very good morning. This is Mrs. Vidya, Assistant Professor, Department of Anatomy, Faculty of Medicine, Sri Lakshmi Narayana Institute of Medical Sciences, Puducherry, affiliated under Bharat Institute of Higher Education and Research. Course code UMB 23 ANA CT 101. Course name Anatomy 1. Topic Histology of female reproductive system. Let's move on to the objective of this topic. It deals with the introduction about the female reproductive system and in detail about the uterus, the microscopic structure of the uterus, vagina, cervix, and also going to deal with the fallopian tube, the histology of the fallopian tube. What about the ovary? What are the follicles related with the ovary? And finally, the microscopic structure of the ovary. So first of all, we're going to discuss about the introduction of the female reproductive system. In the female reproductive system, it consists of the viscera called as the uterus. It is a childbearing organ which is present in the pelvic cavity. And it has a paired ovary, we call it as a female gonads. And it has a paired fallopian tube, otherwise called it as a uterine tube, which passes the oviduct from the ovary to the uterus. And it has a cervix and the vagina, the passage for the female reproductive tract. The first we're going to discuss about the uterus. It is a pear-shaped organ. Anatomically, the uterus is divided into fundus. So this one is the fundus of the uterus and the body of the uterus. And it ends at the cervix. The external genitalia comes under the opening in the female reproductive, call it as a vagina. So it consists of the three different parts of the uterus, fundus, body, and the cervix part. So coming to the dimension of the uterus, it is 7.5 into 5 into 2.5 centimeter. The layers of the uterus, it consists of the three layers, endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. Metrium means uterus, endo means inner. So the inner lining of the uterus cavity, we call it as an endometrium. The middle layer, we call it as a myometrium, which consists of the smooth muscles. The perimetrium is the outermost covering of the uterus. In this picture, we can see the endometrium layer, which is present inside the uterus, and the myometrium, which is filled with the smooth muscle wall. And finally, the serosa are nothing but the perimetrium, which is going to cover the uterus in the outermost covering wall. Here you can see the paired ovary, the female gonads, which is going to contribute for the ovum, or they call it as an egg. It produces the egg. This is called as a fallopian tube or uterine tube, which carries the oviduct from the ovary to the uterus. The end part of the uterus consists of the cervix, and the passage called it as the female reproductive, external also called as vagina. This picture showing the histology of the layer of the uterine wall, the perimetrium wall, the outermost layer, and the myometrium wall. In the perimetrium and the myometrium, we can see the stratum vasculare, which is blood supply. The blood vessels present in the between the perimetrium and the myometrium. This is the endometrial wall, the innermost lining of the uterine cavity. So let's move on with the perimetrium. The perimetrium consists of the histological picture of the perimetrium, which the layer consists of the mesothelial cells, the connective tissue layer, and the blood vessels. So this one is the endometrial layer. It consists of the mesothelium cell where it have the connective tissue and some amount of the blood vessels also, which we can view in the perimetrium layer of the uterus. Next is the myometrium. Myometrium, and myo means muscle, which is consist of the smooth muscle bundles in the middle layer of the uterine cavity. It consists of the two muscle bundles. One is the outer longitudinal bundle, then the middle circular bundle. The middle circular bundle, you have a stratum vasculare, and the inner you have a reticular type of the smooth muscle bundle fiber, which is the living ligature of the uterus. Next is an endometrium layer. Endometrium layer is the innermost layer which is in the uterus. It consists of, in the histology picture, it consists of the simple ciliated columnar epithelium cells. The endometrium divided into lamina propria. The lamina propria consists of the stroma cells, tubular uterine glands, the blood vessels, lymphatics, and the nerves. So let's move on with the detail about the endometrium. That endometrium layer further divided into stratum bisalis and the stratum functionalis. So stratum are nothing but the layer. So here they're dividing this layer into outer basal layer and the inner functional layer. The myometrium has outer basal layer, we call it as a stratum basale, and the inner functional layer called as stratum functionale. So the stratum basal is occupied the 1/3 of the endometrium layer, and it helps in the regeneration, and it's supplied by the straight arteries. In the histology of this endometrium layer, you can see there's two layers. One is the stratum basal layer called zona basalis. Here you can see the stratum functionale, nothing but the zona functionalis. So the outer basal layer and the inner functional layer. The inner functional layer of stratum functional, which is occupied by the 2/3 of the endometrium. And what is the function of the stratum functional? The name itself, it's having some function where it's going to shed off during the menstrual period. But in the stratum basal is the outer basal layer. When the functional layer is going to shred off, this basal layer going to regenerate. That way I'm giving this here as a helps in regeneration. This picture showing this, the two layers of the endometrium, stratum basal and the stratum functionale. Here you can see there is a straight artery in the stratum basal. Here, see, this one is the straight artery in the stratum basal, but here you can see the spiral artery. Next, move on to the endometrial changes in the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle comes under the 3 different types of phases. First one, we call it as a follicular phase, otherwise a proliferative phase. Second one, secretory phase. Third one, menstrual phase. The follicular phase or proliferative phase, which is then going to secrete the estrogen hormone. It takes place with the timing of the 4th to 14th day of the menstruation period. This comes under the follicle secretion. Follicles are going to produce in this phase. That way, call it as a follicular phase, otherwise a proliferative phase. Next is an secretory phase. Secretory phase, which going to secrete something. Here, the hormone going to secrete by the menstrual period. The secretory phase are called secretion of the progesterone. It is about 15 to 28th day. Next is a menstrual phase, which is going to secrete the progesterone. It's first 3 or 4 days. So these are the endometrial changes which takes place in the cycle. The 3 phases, what the phase is going to secrete and what are the days where the secretory phase is going to take place. The first move on to the follicular phase in detail. I already told the follicular phase, otherwise called as a proliferative phase. It is having some functional layers and the stromal layer. The functional layer are 3 to 4 mm in thickness. The stroma, it consists of the abundant cells and the cellulose, the fibroblastic cell, collagen fibers, and the reticular fibers. It consists of straight endometrial glands, which is going to secrete the endometrial fluids. So that is comes under the stroma of the follicular phase, and it has a long and coiled spiral arteries. So when you have a histological picture in the follicular phase, we can see the coiled spiral arteries in the stromal layer of the proliferative phase. This picture showing the follicular phase of the uterine wall. You can see the differentiation between the myometrium and the endometrium here. The myometrium, which consists of the smooth muscles and interstitial connective tissues. Coming to the endometrium, we already discussed about the two layers, stratum basal and stratum functional. So this one is the basal layer, this one is the functional layer. Here you can see the stromas, the lamina propria, the stromal layers, and we can view some of the uterine glands which is in the basal layer, and also the coiled spiral arteries can view here. So this picture is an histology picture of the proliferative phase. You can view the uterine glands and the coiled arteries. Next is in secretory phase. The secretory phase of the endometrium, which is 6 to 7 mm in thickness. The name itself have a secretory. So we have some of the fluid secretion. So there is a collection of the fluid in the stroma. They have a endometrial glands. That glands are very tortuous. So tortuous are nothing but the spiral. And it has acquired lateral circulation. Here, the secretory phase of the histology is showing the sawtooth appearance. That nothing but the lateral circulation. The endometrial glands are tortuous and it's showing the sawtooth appearance. And coming to the arteries, it is highly coiled and also very spiral. So here, which we can see the myometrium layer, the smooth muscle bundle and the blood vessels. Here we can view the endometrium layer. It consists of the functional basal and the functional, stratum basal and the stratum functional layer. The basal layer consists of the uterine glands. You can see here there is a difference in the uterine glands and it is very tortuous when compared with the proliferative phase. Here you can functional layer. We have the lamina propria with the coiled are filled, the coiled arteries, and you can see this uterine glands are filled with the fluid in this called a secretory phase. So that is called secretion that we can observe in the secretory phase. So this shows the secretory phase histology picture that is filled with the fluid and the uterine glands are coiled and the blood vessels are spiraled. Next is an menstrual phase. So the menstrual phase of the endometrium, which consists of the constriction of the coiled arteries, but when compared with the proliferative and the secretory, which is on the spiraled and coiled artery, here there is a constriction of the coiled arteries. And the entire stratum functional is going to shed in the menstrual phase. Yeah, what about the menstrual? What about the menses? It's nothing but the shredding of the that is endometrium cells. Here, the entire stratum functional going to shed off in the menstrual phase. That is one of the clue here. Next is in necrosis. What is the meaning of necrosis? The cell death. Ischemic condition, the cell death. So that is called necrosis. Here, the full endometrium going to cell death condition. And also, we can view the eroded surface of the in the endometrium, which is covered by the some of the blood clots. So these are the very important points in the menstrual phase of the endometrium. This picture showing the menstrual phase of the endometrium histological view. Here, this is the myometrium full of smooth muscle fiber. The endometrium consists of the lamina propria of the stratum bizalis and the intact uterine glands of the stratum bizalis. Here you can see the coiled arteries. I told you there's one coiled arteries, and the uterine glands are also very tortuous. And in the menstrual phase, there is a blood clot here. The blood is disintegrating in the uterine glands, and you can see the blood clots in the lamina propria. This picture showing the menstrual phase of the endometrium. So this is the histology of the menstrual phase endometrium layer. Highly coiled uterine gland, and you can see some of the blood clots in the uterine glands. So this picture showing the difference between the three different phases. Yeah, the first one, we can see the early proliferative phase where the arteries are the basal artery, the endometrial artery, or the endometrial gland, the spiral artery. You can see here it is somewhat spiral and tortuous. But coming with the glands, it is longer. There is no tortuous in the early proliferative phase. But coming with the late proliferative phase, the endometrial gland are tortuous and highly coiled blood vessels, which we can see here. But coming with the secretory phase, there is a lot of highly coiled uterine glands and filled with some secretion. That is the secretory phase. This is the histology picture of the four different types of phase: early proliferative, late proliferative, secretory, and menstrual. Here you can see in the early proliferative phase, the stratum functional and the stratum basal. You can see the long uterine glands and some of the coiled arteries in the early proliferative. But when come with the late proliferative, you can see the uterine glands here and highly coiled spiral arteries. When with the secretory phase, you can see all the uterine glands are filled with the fluids, the secretions. In coming to the menstrual, it is filled with the blood clots. Next, we move on to the cervix. So cervix are nothing but the passage for the uterus. That is consist of mucosal layer, muscle layer, and the serosa. So the mucosa in the cervix, which consists of the two different parts. One is in cervical canal, another one is in vaginal part. The cervical canal, which is composed of the simple columnar type of epithelium, is present. But coming to the vaginal part, it consists of the stratified squamous epithelium. When coming with the mucosa in the lamina propria, it has a small cervical glands. So this picture showing the endocervical epithelium are nothing but the cervical canal consists of the simple columnar epithelium, and the vaginal part consists of stratified squamous epithelium. So this is this squamous epithelium. When coming to the muscle layer of the cervix, it is an irregular smooth muscle, and the coming to this collagen, and it is elastic in nature. So it's called elastic fibers. And the serous is coat. So coming with the next is an vagina. The vagina was divided into mucosal layer, muscle layer, and the adventitial layer. So the mucosa, which is present in the vagina, it is coated by the cell. The epithelium are nothing but the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. So this one is the stratified squamous non-keratinized epithelium. And there is no particular gland in the vagina. But in the cervix, we can see the cervical glands. Vagina, there is no gland. And coming to the broad lamina propria. See, this one is the broad lamina propria. And it has a elastic fibers. Coming with the muscular layer, it consists of oblique and longitudinal smooth muscle fibers. The adventitia consists of just a connective tissue. Next, we move on to the gross of the uterine tube. The uterine tube, otherwise called it as a fallopian tube, it carries the oviduct from the ova from the ovary to the uterus. It's just a passage, a tube-like structure. So it's going to carry the oviduct. So I told you it's a convey ova from the ovary to the uterine cavity. It is almost 10 centimeter in length. In anatomically, the uterine tube or the fallopian tube are divided into 4 parts. The first one is an intramural part or interstitial part, this one. Next is an isthmus part. Next one, ampulla. Another one, infundibulum. Finally, it ends like a fimbriae, where it's going to carry the ova from the ovary. So these are the 4 parts of the uterine tube. Next, we move on to the layers of the fallopian tube. It consists of a mucosal layer, muscle, and the serosal layer. The first one, mucosa, which is consist of branching of the numerous mucosal fold, and the lumen is irregular in shape. It consists of a simple ciliated columnar epithelium, and also it is having a ciliated. Why it consists of the ciliated cells? Because I told you it's a fimbriae-like structure which carries the oviduct from the ovary to the uterus. So it's this ciliated cell with cilia which move like a flagella. Yeah, it's moving like this. So when you carry the egg, the fallopian tube, the mucosal layer will push the egg to the uterine cavity. So it is type of cilial cells which is present in the mucosa. And also have some amount of the non-ciliated secretory cell. It doesn't have cilia, but it's going to secrete something else. So that consists of non-ciliated secretory cell. The special name for this cell called as PEG cells. This comes under the mucosal layer of the uterine tube. Next is a muscle layer. The muscle layer have 2 types of muscles, inner circular layer and outer longitudinal layer. So coming to the serosa, the outer covering are nothing but the peritoneal covering of the uterine cavity. This is the picture we're showing the fallopian tube. You can see the 2 different types of layers, the muscle coat, outer longitudinal muscle layer and the inner circular. Coming to the epithelium, the lumen of the uterine tube, I told you they have a numerous mucosal folds. Yeah, you can see the numerous mucosal folds, the lamina propria and the interstitial connective tissue. Finally, the serosa are nothing but the peritoneal covering here. Irregular lumens also we can see here. This is the irregular lumen. So the same picture we're showing the connective tissue, the muscle wall, the adventitial layer, the epithelium, and the irregular lumen. We discussed about the 2 types of cells in the uterine tube. One is a ciliated cells, another one a non-ciliated secretory cell. That name is nothing but the. So here this picture showing this 2 different types of cells. One is having a cilia, so that comes under the ciliated cell. Another one consists of non-ciliated, but it's going to secrete a fluid. Here you call it as the non-ciliated secretory cell called as PEG cells. So these are the PEG cells. This showing the epithelium of the uterine cavity, the simple columnar epithelium. You can see the basement membrane and the different types of cells. The cilia cells. See, there is a ciliated cells. You have a cilia. But next to that, you have a non-ciliated secretory cell, nothing but the PEG cells. Let's move on to the ovary. Ovary, we already know it is a female gonad, a paired one. It is almond shaped and it is attached to the broad ligament. So this one is the ovary, which is an almond shape. The either side of the uterus is present a paired female gonad, but it is connected by the thick ligament called it as a broad ligament. Coming to the dimension of the ovary, it is 3 into 1.5 into 1 centimeter in thickness. The ovary consists of germinal epithelium, tunica albuginea, outer cortex layer, inner medullary layer. You can see in this picture, the ovary consists of the outer epithelial cells are called as a germinal epithelium. And below to this, you can see the tunica albuginea layer, the orange color. Next, outer, we call it as the cortex layer, and innermost, we call it as the medullary layer. Let's move on with the detail about the germinal epithelium layer. The germinal epithelium, already we discussed the outermost covering of this ovary. It consists of epithelium because it comes names under germinal epithelium. It consists of simple squamous or simple cuboidal epithelium. The tunica albuginea is the innermost layer, which consists of a dense connective tissue. And coming to this, I told you it divided into cortex layer and the medullary layer. The outer cortex, which is filled by the follicles, the follicular cells. The follicles are nothing but the primary follicle, primordia, secondary follicle, like that. The follicles, which is in the connective tissue stroma, that we can observe in the outer cortex layer of the ovary. And along with that, you can view the blood vessels, nerves, and also the lymphatics. In the medullary layer, it consists of loose connective tissue and it is highly vascular, that is rich in blood supply. This picture showing the ovarian follicle. So you can see the follicular cells. The follicular cells, the ovarian follicle, which starts from the primordia. The first one is the primordia follicles. Next is in primary follicles. The cycle will change. Yeah. The primary follicle, then it converted as a secondary follicle, then it will mature as a mature follicle called as a Graafian follicle, then it will shrink out as a corpus luteum, finally it becomes a scar as a corpus albicans. So these are the follicles which present in the ovaries, which we can observe in the cortex layer. The first move on to the ovarian follicle. The ovarian follicle, which consists of these common features. The ovarian follicle consists of first one, the nucleus. The central nucleus is present, we call it a primary oocyte. And it is peripherally surrounded by the some cells, we call it as a follicular cells. So this is the central nucleus, we call it as a primary oocyte. And it's surrounded by the surrounding cells, we call it as a periphery cells. There are two different types of cells. One is the follicular cells, another one granulosa cells. The follicular cells are nothing but the oocyte surrounded by the single layer. So this is the oocyte, which is surrounded by single layer of flat epithelial cell, that call it as a follicular cells. But the oocyte is surrounded by multiple layers of cells. Multiple layer of cells, call it as a granulosa cells. So you must know the two types of cells which is in the ovarian cycle. One is a follicular cell where the oocyte surrounded by the single layer. Next one, the oocyte surrounded by the multiple layer, or call it as a granulosa layer. Next is a primordial follicle. The primordial follicle are the centrally placed the primary oocyte, and the peripheral you have a flat follicular cells. It is 25 mm in size. You can see the primary oocyte in the center and it's surrounded by the flat follicular cells. And it consists of the primordia, the primordial follicle. Next, you can see the basal laminae. There's a unilaminar primary follicle, single layer. The zona pellucida is formed in this layer. When you have a primary follicle, that is called multilaminar primary follicle, you have a zona pellucida, granulosa cells. So this picture showing the layers of the ovary. The first one is the germinal epithelial layer, and you can see the follicles which is in the cortex, the stroma, the oocyte which is centrally placed by the nucleus, and it's surrounded by single layer of the epithelium called as follicular cells. So this is the primordial follicle. Next is primary follicle. The oocyte, which is consists of 50 to 80 central oocyte, is present, but it is surrounded by the cube-shaped cells that are called cuboidal cells. In this primary follicle, which we can see the zona pellucida, a line with covered by the periphery of the oocyte. That is nothing but the glycoprotein, which is going to surrounded by the cell in the primary oocyte. That is called as zona pellucida, nothing but a glycoprotein cell. And it is have a single layer and it also have a multiple layers. So this one is the unilaminar primary follicle, which consists of zona pellucida here and the single layer of follicular cell. In this picture showing the zona pellucida, the glycoprotein which covers the primary oocyte, and it has a more number of multiple layers, the granulosa cells. The stroma is divided into theca interna and the theca externa cells. So these are the theca interna and the theca externa cells, which is surrounded internally called as theca interna, which is covered by the externally called as theca externa. So this showing this nucleus of the primary oocyte. The pink color stained is nothing but the zona pellucida, the glycoprotein which covers the central nucleus. And you can see the cube-shaped cells are the multiple layer of the cells, the granulosa cells. And the stroma consists of the theca interna and theca externa. Yeah, this showing this in detail. You can see the primary oocyte, the nucleus, the zona pellucida layer, the basement membrane, and the more number of the multiple layer of the cuboidal cell, and nothing but the granulosa cells. Next, we move on to the secondary follicle, otherwise called as antral follicle. Why it is called as antral follicle? Here, this oocyte is 125 mm in size. The follicle consists of 0.2 mm in size. It is I already told the antral means the fluid-filled space. In the secondary follicle, we can view the fluid-filled space. That is nothing but the antrum. We can view the antral follicle here. So in this picture, we can see the primary oocyte surrounded by the zona pellucida, and you can see the fluid filled space are nothing but the antrum. And here, the theca interna are more in number, and it's highly vascular, and it's going to secrete the estrogen hormone. When coming to the Graafian follicle, we call it as a Graafian follicle as a mature follicle. Okay, it comes under the 10 mm in diameter. The cavities in between the follicular cells to form a single layer antrum. So I told you the antrum are the space filled, just a space filled cavity. This is the primary oocyte, which is, you can see the space here, that is an antrum. And the layer of the follicular cells is surrounded by the oocyte called here corona radiata. So this is the primary oocyte, the follicular cells which is surrounded the oocyte called here is a corona radiata. Next, the follicular cells concentrated at one point, even though it is surrounded by the full cell, but you have a concentrated at one point here. The cells are concentrated at one point together. That we call it as a cumulus oophorus. So this is called as cumulus oophorus. This type of corona radiata, cumulus oophorus, which we can visible in the Graafian follicle cells and nothing but the mature follicles. So this picture showing the oocyte, the zona pellucida layer, the granulosa cells, the cumulus oophorus, theca interna, theca externa. Next is in corpus luteum. Here, this menstrual cycles are completed, then it comes under the corpus luteum. The follicles are collapsed and infolded, and the invasion of the blood vessels and the stromal cells are seen in the corpus luteum. the granulosa cells and the theca cells are get enlarged, and the fluid going to get accumulated in the granular cells and also in the theca cells. The granulosa have the lutein, special here, the granulosa lutein cells which you can view in the corpus luteum that going to produce the progesterone hormone. And it have a two lutein cell, one is a granulosa lutein cell and the theca lutein cell. I told you the granulosa and the theca cells are enlarged in the corpus luteum. So that layer comes under the granulosa lutein cell and the theca lutein cell. The granulosa lutein cell going to produce the progesterone, theca lutein cell going to produce the estrogen. So this image showing the corpus luteum. So this one is the corpus luteum. I told you the follicles are get collapsed and enfolded of the blood vessels and the stromal cells. The histology picture of the corpus luteum in detail. You can see the two lutein cells, theca lutein cells here, and the granulosa lutein cells. Next is an corpus albicans are nothing but the scar of the corpus luteum. Finally, the corpus luteum might become a scar that we call it as a corpus albicans. So they can see this small stroma, ovarian stroma, the blood vessels, and the corpus albicans. Finally, which we can view the ovarian cycle in this picture. The primary follicle, which consists of the central nucleus, surrounded by the single layer of cell called follicular cell, the multiple layer of cell called granulosa cell. Next is a secondary follicle, which is surrounded by the granulosa cells and the theca externa and the theca interna. Next, vesicular follicle or antrum, the fluid-filled space. They call it as a mature or Graafian follicle filled by the zona pellucida, corona radiata, and the cumulus oophoris. Then the ovulation going to take place. It's going to produce the ova, it rupture of the egg. Finally, it will become as a shrink. All the follicles get enfolded and shrinked as a corpus luteum formation. Finally, it get regressed and become a scar that is called as corpus albicans. This is called ovarian cycle. Below that, you can see the menstrual cycle. Already we discussed the three different types of phases: menstrual phase, proliferative phase, and the secretory phase. 1, 2, 4, or 5 days call it as a menstrual flow or the menstrual phase. Then from the 6th day to 14th day, call it as a proliferative phase. Then the 14th or 15th day to 30 days, we call it as a secretory phase. So these two pictures showing the about the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Thank you.